And so that creates cognitive load, and that creates a lot of friction in the system because developers are overwhelmed by just the sheer complexity of having to understand all these different things, different programming languages, and so on, and or configuration languages, and so they, a lot of times developers are just stuck, right? They don't want to mess things up, and so they rather basically just ping their either more senior colleagues or operations colleagues, so that they can help them out. And what that then in turn leads to is waiting times for developers on the one hand, and sort of ticket ops and a lot of bottlenecks on the operation side of things, and that's kind of the current issue with DevOps really today, and what platform engineering ultimately is trying to address.
Luca, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So today we're going to be taking a kind of a deep dive into an area of engineering known as platform engineering, which I think is a relatively new concept. So I think it's going to be really interesting for people to learn about. But perhaps before we get there, you could take a minute and introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm Luca. I run product at Humanitech, and I'm probably better known on Twitter for being a core contributor to the platform engineering community. I moderate the Slack over there. We have 10,000 plus platform engineers in there right now. I co-host PlatformCon, which is the #1 platform engineering conference that is taking place in June. And I also write Platform Weekly that goes out to about 10,000 people every week.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like you are the perfect person to have this conversation with then.
Well, one of them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So maybe I feel like a natural place to start for anyone in the audience that is maybe not super familiar with the concept of platform engineering is to simply, what is platform engineering?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I think about it is, platform engineering is the art, because it's really kind of an art more than a science, of basically taking all the tech and tools that you have in the enterprise, especially today, and binding them into a golden path that enables developer self-service, while also reducing the cognitive load on the individual contributor, on the developer. And the superset of these golden paths is what is commonly referred to in the community as an internal developer platform, or IDP for short. And that IDP is really kind of like the end product of platform engineering, and specifically of a platform team.
I see. So there's a couple things there that I kind of want to dive into. So you used the term cognitive load there. That's something I'm familiar with from my old human-computer interaction days. But could you explain what you mean by cognitive load and how that essentially impacts a user, I guess in this case, a developer?
Totally. Well, so let's take the example of I just want to deploy a small change to a front-end service to test something as a front-end engineer, right? Well, so if we look back 10 or 15 years ago, we used much simpler setups, right? Our infrastructure was a lot simpler. You didn't have this crazy cloud native convergence of trends and technologies and everything. And so if you just wanted to do that, you'd probably touch, let's say, I don't know, one script, one CD tool, something like that, and you'd be good. Today, in especially the enterprise, but even just mid-sized engineering organizations upwards, what that looks like is oftentimes having to touch a Helm chart, a couple of YAML files, a Terraform module, and a couple of other tools in your tool chain. And so that creates cognitive load. And that creates a lot of friction in the system because developers are overwhelmed by just the sheer complexity of having to understand all these different things, different programming languages, and so on. And or configuration languages, and so they, a lot of times developers are just stuck, right? They don't want to mess things up, and so they rather basically just ping their either more senior colleagues or operations colleagues, so that they can help them out. And what that then in turn leads to is waiting times for developers on the one hand, and sort of ticket ops and a lot of bottlenecks on the operation side of things, and that's kind of the current issue with DevOps really today, and what platform engineering ultimately is trying to address.
I see. Yeah. So it's like, maybe an analogy would be, when I was a kid, or maybe even earlier than that, when you were watching television, my parents' generation, you watched television, you had like one or two channels. So there wasn't a lot of cognitive load with making the decision about what you're going to watch, because essentially that decision was already made for you. And then now you fast forward today, there's like, 10 different streaming networks with essentially unlimited content, and you're just like overwhelmed, and you don't know what to watch. So, and I think is like a developer today, we have all this power at our fingertips. There's, endless tools to do amazing things, but there's a cost essentially associated with that, because now we have like basically like a deer in the headlights moment of like, wow, there's so much stuff I don't even know where to get started, or it just adds a lot of complexity essentially to our deployment and our actually internal development.
I love that analogy. It's actually, even if you refine it, it's like, every time you go on Netflix and you want to look for something, and then you just like spend 30 minutes with your partner just arguing on what, and you end up watching nothing in the end. You just give up on it.
I end up usually just going back and rewatching something that I've already watched. Exactly. Because I'm just like, I can't spend the energy to figure out something new right now.
Exactly. That's actually a really good analogy for cognitive load. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So where did this, concept of platform engineering originate?
So the the original concept actually comes from ThoughtWorks. Were some of the first folks kind of like to mention it, but and then that basically got later so that was in the Technology Writer in 2017, and then that got later popularized by Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton in their book Team Topology. So they were some of the first folks to actually formulate it as a concept. But platform engineering really has been around for probably like at least a decade, if not 15 years at this point. And, to kind of understand that, maybe it's helpful sort of like take a step back and look at the, the history of DevOps, right? So when DevOps came out, at this point, 15, 20 years ago, the world was a very different place. As we said earlier, right? It was much more simple. You had less complex infrastructure, no Kubernetes, no crazy 10,000 tooling landscape at CNCF, right? And the initial idea of DevOps was really simple. It was basically, tear down that mythological fence between the sysadmin and the and the developers, and really just facilitate collaboration between devs and ops. Easy. The issue is that turned quickly, morphed into a DevOps reality that is not ideal. And it's literally what we were talking about earlier, is the developers being stuck, operations being stuck on the other end, and fighting ticket ops and trying to put out fires all the time. And that's really what the reality of DevOps looks like for the vast majority of engineering organizations today. And so that's not ideal. But so if you look at that timeline, the first companies to realize, this thing is not really scaling and is creating some problems, were very large engineering organizations, right? So we're talking about the Airbnbs, the Spotifys, the Googles of the world, who literally have to, I've had to onboard hundreds of developers a month. And they were onboarding them to an increasingly complex cloud native setup. And so they quickly realized, okay, I can't expect hundreds of new developers to, be familiar with this increasingly complex footprint that of their cloud that they were building. And so they kind of realized, okay, I need to build some sort of platform layer here in between the operation side of things and the application developers in order to enable developer self-service effectively, so that developers don't need to wait, and then operations can have this layer in between the infrastructure and the developers to streamline how configurations are managed and how resources and infrastructure are consumed, and so on and so forth, right? And so that's really where platform engineering got started. And then has been basically trickling down for the last 10 to 15 years to less advanced engineering organizations and smaller companies. And so in that sense, platform engineering is really this discipline of building these golden paths and enabling self-service and so on that we discussed earlier. But it's also really the way of enabling true DevOps, right? The idea that the core tenet of DevOps, which is you build it, you run it, that is actually possible at the enterprise in the cloud native era through platform engineering and by building an internal developer platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense that something like this came out of those large, engineering organizations like Airbnb or, maybe like a Google or a Meta. Because if you look at like a company like Google, for example, they have probably 70 to 80,000 full-time engineers. Like there's not a lot of organizations in the world that have that many engineers working on products within one organization. And they're just going to essentially reach scale issues far before most like typical sort of like smaller companies are going to reach. And then of course, so they're kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to certain innovations, I guess, in the landscape or the definition of certain like roles and functions because of the scale with which they're actually operating in.
Right. Exactly.
So you mentioned, several times like DevOps and it's sort of the relationship between DevOps and platform engineering. So how does the platform engineering essentially compare to engineering functions like DevOps or SREs?
Yeah, so I think a really important sort of trait of successful platform initiatives that I've seen, being rolled out at engineering organizations of very various sizes, is that from the get-go, they make very clear what the mission and vision for that platform team is. And it is really important that within that mission, it's clear what is the difference between the platform team and the existing, usually DevOps, infrastructure, SRE teams, right? And so the platform team doesn't replace those functions at all, right? Like you still need to have people that are focused on the reliability, scalability, maintainability of your overall infrastructure, load balancing traffic across, clusters in different regions, and so on and so forth. And so then in that sense, the platform team is really focused on one major thing that is different from those other teams, which is shipping a product. And that is also kind of like what sets the sort of like your platform engineer apart from your DevOps engineer, right? Is this product mindset, which you could argue, and I have argued about this with some DevOps folks that it, in some cases it is already what they've been doing, right? And so in that case, it's fantastic, right? You've already basically been building some sort of like product for your application developers to consume. But the reality set is, in a lot of cases, DevOps try to almost kind of like teach technologies, right, and workflows to developers instead of shipping a product that enables them to self-serve everything, right, and thereby removing themselves from the equation really entirely, which is kind of what you want, is really this separation of concerns. And so that's really this really goes back to kind of this core idea that we advocate for in the community, which is platform as a product, right? And the great thing of doing this, you know, mindset shift towards this product mindset is that then all the things that we've learned around product management in the last 20, 30 years apply at that point, right? And so whether it's like rollout strategies, MVPing, lighthouse adoptions, road mapping, all of those things, all of that applies now. And so that's really where the kind of like product management and product manager becomes also a really important figure for your platform initiative. But to go back to your question, it's really the mission, the vision, and clearly defining that, right? Because I've seen platform initiatives fail where the platform team hadn't communicated that clearly to the rest of the organization. And so effectively the developers and the rest of the org ended up viewing them as just yet another DevOps or infrastructure team. And then you just fall back into the same kind of like vicious circle of ticket ops, basically. And that's not what you want.
Yeah. So you mentioned this concept, essentially, like you're focused on, or part of the focus is like shipping a product. And in this case, if I understand things correctly, the product is essentially the developer platform, the internal developer platform that your other parts of your engineering organization are going to be using to essentially develop whatever it is that your company ships as a product for maybe like a customer. Is that understanding correct? It's essentially the internal platform with which your application engineers and so forth are going to actually be developing and shipping product on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that mindset shift that I was talking about is really around understanding, hey, your developers are your internal customers, i.e. the users of your product, the IDP. And that's really that mindset shift that, sometimes can cost people some effort, right? Because again, if you think about, okay, what's the ideal profile of a platform engineer, right? Probably you should have like a solid understanding of your kind of, Kubernetes, CI/CD workflows, GitOps, Terraform, and your cloud native tool or technology du jour. But if you come from a DevOps or SRE position, you probably already have some degree of understanding of that, right? And so then it really boils down to this, shift of understanding, hey, my developers are my customers, right? And then, building and shipping the platform as a product and everything that we just said. And then the other bit that really highly relates to the first one is then communication, right? Because then it becomes extremely important as a platform engineer that you really build that feedback loop with your developers, and frankly, and you listen, right? And so one thing that I sort of like often kind of try to explain this with is like, well, if you think about let's say you were to plot on your y-axis kind of like communication skills from like 0 to infinite, and time of our industry is on the x-axis, right? You basically could plot like a sort of like a line up into the right from your sysadmin to your infrastructure engineer, cloud ops, DevOps, and then eventually platform engineer, because your platform engineer is going to be the one that in this evolution has to really have good communication skills, right? Because they need to communicate with developers, but also with C-level, and we can get a little bit more into that as well. But you really have just two different or three different stakeholder groups that need to like sort of like collaborate for the platform initiative to be successful, right?
Yeah, it sounds like in some respects, like this role, or if you're working as a platform engineer, has some similar characteristics that you'd want to find in someone who's typically working in like a developer advocacy or developer relations engineering role as well, where you're an engineer, but it's also very focused on feedback loops and communication, but they're the focus is what is the external product, the API, the open source product, whereas this is more internal facing. And actually, in my time when I worked at Google, there's actually internal developer relations that focus solely on essentially feedback for these platform teams to improve the internal engineering tools and the efficiency with which the teams work.
Exactly. And that's where, like I was mentioning earlier, it's really important, this role of the product manager of the platform. Because yeah, as you said, like in very large organizations, you'll actually have dedicated internal developer relations people that will target these things. You also actually have, I think, interestingly, I was talking to Aaron Erickson, who also contributed a lot to the platform engineer community. He wrote a couple of pieces on platformengineering.org, and he built the platform at Salesforce some years back. And he was actually telling me how at Salesforce they had 2 or 3 different platform teams competing with each other, right? And that's where it becomes really interesting, because it's really the sort of like the ultimate expression of that requiring this communication skills and product mindset, right? Because then you're really shipping a product the same way a startup would, which means it's not just about the product, it's about the go-to-market as well, right? So you need to have this communication skills to understand who your customers are, and like what competition is doing, and like how do we roll it out, and like what's our go-to-market, and how do we compete and everything, right? And so that's kind of like the main expression, but in or the ultimate expression. But in the vast majority of cases, most engineering organizations don't have the resources to have competing platform teams, nor, frankly, like dedicated developer advocates just for internal purposes, right? Because maybe they're not that large, or they just don't, have that level of resources to invest in that. And so that's where the role of the product manager, as I was saying, becomes really, really important, because the product manager becomes the link between these 3 different stakeholders, right? So they're the ones that need to go and sell up into C-level and executives and get that executive buy-in. And they're the ones that have to figure out the product market fit with the developers. And they're also the ones that will have to, so at the beginning, right? But then eventually also like advocate for other development groups to progressively adopt the platform as it grows. And they're also the ones that will have to load balance that tricky relationship sometimes with existing DevOps infrastructure SRE teams, right? So they don't step on each other's toes. And so you can see how it really becomes like almost like an ambassador diplomat level type of a communication skill. And I think it's super interesting. And the product management channel in the platform engineering Slack space has been, I think, one of the most interesting ones to follow for me personally, at least, because it was unlike other channels, it was actually created by community members and not by us, and it has some of the most interesting threads going on, because it's literally like you see the struggle of all these product practitioners that come into the community and try to like share best practices, and there's just so many dimensions to this that we could talk about it for an hour.
Yeah. And I would imagine working as a product manager for like a platform engineering team, you need to not only be like a strong communicator and be able to kind of fill the gap of this like advocacy role within your own organization, but you also probably need a fair amount of technical depth in order to be sort of credible as a PM working in that space.
Exactly. And that's where, you're really looking for a unicorn, right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
it's these people that need, as you said, need to have like street cred with both the DevOps teams and the platform teams. And these are people that, I mean, are some of the, best, depending on the engineering org, but some of the best like systems, engineers out there. So they're not, a junior coder. And at the same time, they have to have the skill set to, speak different languages, because that's really what it boils down to, right? Like the lingo that you use with, your C-level and executives to get executive buy-in is completely different than the language that you need to speak to developers, right? So in the former, you have to talk about total like cutting time to market, and total lead time, and your DORA metrics, and if there is already some level of buy-in for rolling a platform, then it's about also TCO, total cost of ownership of that platform, and what are the trade-offs that we're doing if we're trying to build everything in-house versus like doing that last mile optimization, all those things that we can get into later. And so that's the language that you need to speak to the C-level. When you go to your developers, is a lot more kind of like down to earth. Hey, like today you're waiting, today you're stuck, and this sucks, and developer experience is terrible, and yada yada yada, and how can we make that better, right? But then that conversation also becomes extremely nuanced around what is the right level of abstraction, and that's also something that maybe we can get into, but also very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you're making about sort of the different type of conversation that you need to have with like the C-level, or whoever is like the controlling of the resources or controlling of the budget versus the developers. I made that mistake in my past life with some developer tooling that I've worked on, where I tried to articulate things to those essentially the people who are the people that control the resources and decisions about what gets invested in around, hey, we need to make life easier essentially for our developers. And it's not that they don't care about those things, but really what they're looking at is what is the business impact of this thing? And you need to really articulate things in terms of that. So it's like, does this generate revenue? Does this decrease our cost? Does this decrease like our time to market? Those types of things are what really matters. And I think that's a good, place to maybe kind of dip into what are sort of the like typical KPIs that a platform engineering team is responsible for. I heard you mention a couple things there, but maybe we can dive into that a little bit deeper.
Totally. Well, so I mean, usually you'll track your DARA metrics, really, in terms of like what's the impact on the engineer organization, and then those will then be sort of like abstracted into like higher level stuff like time to market, as we said, right? So if you speak to your C-level, your mean time to recovery is not gonna resonate too much, I think, right? Ultimately, when you talk about your DORA metrics, we're talking about lead time, right? So how long it takes the team to go from code committed to something production ready, and then you have deployment frequency, change failure rate, and then MTTR, or mean time to recovery. And so that's ultimately how we see a lot of teams tracking, like, okay, what's the impact of a platform on this kind of like more quantitative metrics, right? And then those can be abstracted into higher level stuff that can be, sold by the product manager, for instance, as we said, to the C-level. Mm-hmm. I think though a less quantitative thing that is much harder to track, because it's really like that part of qualitative feedback where then your kind of like user research and user surveys come into place, is just overall satisfaction. People, when they talk about developer experience, it can be something like really abstract, and we definitely see it not resonating a lot with C-level, because it's like, oh, DevX, whatever, nice to have. Mm-hmm. But actually, when you really like dive a little bit deeper and you see just like the sheer amount of frustration that is in the system in a lot of these teams today, because of this DevOps friction that we were talking about, it's crazy. Just like the productivity gain that you can get from rolling out a platform. And so that's the other way of sort of like measuring success of a platform initiative, and something that then again is up to the sort of like platform owners to turn into relatable metrics for the different stakeholders, right? But that's because like you can easily like extrapolate then lead time from that, and productivity, and then time to market eventually, and like impact on your bottom line, right? As an org. So is again, that's where that those communication skills become really, really important. To listen and get that initial feedback and understand how good of a job you're doing at improving, or how bad of a job, right? Because like we also see a lot of like anti-patterns in the way people build and ship platforms. And one is, simply sounds so stupid, but like it's like not delivering enough a product that is 10x better, right? And if you have something that is just like 1.5 better than the existing workflow, then you have just too much friction for developers to jump over, right? Like now you're disrupting the way they learn to do things. Why would they, right? And so that's one thing that I think it's like very simple, right? But it's like just build something that is 10x better, which is not that hard when you consider how bad the situation is today, right? But you need to do that.
Yeah, I think like I imagine one of the challenges in this space from like a perceived business value of a kind of nice to have versus like this is a must have. I think companies like Stripe, Twilio, SendGrid, they've done an amazing job with sort of popularizing that like DevX developer experience like matters from like a go to market or from a like product differentiator but that's like you can see that as an external company that's like trying to essentially emulate those people. But if you're doing platform really well, it's like internal. You don't know like why is it that this company can ship product so fast. You don't necessarily know unless they're talking about it essentially. So is there a challenge essentially around creating more like external advocacy for platform engineering being a must-have for companies versus sort of something that's seen as or perceived as a nice-to-have?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Because the companies that you mentioned did do that, but they did that for basically your kind of like bottom up single player mode type of products, right? And so that's where that makes a ton of sense, because like if I'm a developer, right, and I need to pick and I need to figure out like a payment solution for my app, and Stripe just gives me this amazing DevX, fantastic, right? That's a no-brainer. The problem is when you talk about this like multiplayer, very complex enterprise products, the like you then have to speak to the C-level, and the C-level cares a lot less about DevX, despite whatever they will tell you in public, right? And so that's where that communication again becomes really, really crucial. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your question, we still have a long way to go, I think, in establishing platform engineering and self-service, and how and this whole thought leadership around how you want your developers to interface themselves with your infrastructure, your configurations, workflows, and so on, and what a huge boost that can have on your top line, bottom line, and so on. And we're just getting started, right? Like ultimately, the community has been growing like crazy, right? We've been building it for the last couple of years. We crossed 10,000 people in the Slack. We PlatformCon had 7,000 signups, 6,000 attendees last year. This year we are 3 months away and we already have 7,000 signups. So we're expecting about 15,000 attendees. So you can see this like sort of like compounding exponentially, really year over year, month over month. Just in the last 6 months, I think the sheer amount of people that are speaking about platform engineering is crazy, probably 10x. Like, I don't know, I don't have hard numbers, but like I just see these like, is DevOps really dead? Articles, just like there's like 10 of them every week, it seems. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, and so, but we're also seeing very established analysts like Gartner, Forrester, really picking this up. And Gartner last year put platform engineer on their hype cycle at the sort of like beginning of the hype cycle. They also nominated it one of the top 10 key trends to look for in 2023. And that is ultimately, sort of like communication and thought leadership that is fed to sort of like your CIOs and C-level and executives and the enterprise. And so I think we're slowly getting there, but there's definitely still a very long way to go. And importantly, I think is part of the reason why I'm really happy to be on podcasts like this is also to really define these things clearly, right? Because the last thing I want to happen is that internal developer platforms end up like GitOps, where nobody really knows what it actually means. And you have like all these different companies trying to like pull for like different definitions. And so like a lot of the work that I'm trying to do and that we're trying to do as a community is to really have a shared understanding of what these best practices are. Because again, it's not like we did anything new, right? Like people had been building platforms for the last decade. It's just that there was definitely a big gap in the industry around just like definitions, best practices, and a shared place for people to come and, kind of like talk about their war stories and mistakes and, what can be done better. And so that's really, I think, it is really something that we need to get right as a community, as in an industry, to not lose another 5 or 10 years of just frustrating developer experience and just not great working environments.
Yeah, it sounds like you're starting to essentially get the momentum of some of these like network effects of this community that's been being built within platform engineering, and essentially like a great signal for that is what you mentioned, like the Gartner hype cycle, and that's kind of, I think, like the start of a lot of, it sounds like the start of a lot of momentum in the area. And I think, as you mentioned, it's not like platform's new, but this concept of essentially like thinking about it like a product and building it like a product, that is sort of the new mindset. And we've seen similar things with, the shift for, in terms of like treating documentation as a product versus, back in the, right. 20 years ago, documentation was like a physical manual that no one wanted to deal with. It was like a terrible experience. And now you have like these, absolutely like beautiful documentation from, of course, companies like Stripe is always like the example that people go to. But now that's kind of like the standard for any company. And it doesn't matter whether you're an enterprise, developer first, developer plus company, like that's the bar and that's what people expect when they come to you. And I imagine as platform engineering becomes more and more like a priority for businesses, that's going to be the expectation when engineers essentially go to organizations like, hey, like this experience as a developer is like terrible. Like I can't ship code, or it's too complicated, or the cognitive load's too much. That's not what I'm used to. I'm going to go somewhere else, essentially.
Absolutely. And that's where I think that work that we were talking about around, building that feedback loop with developers becomes so crucial, because you really are going to have, and this is ultimately, what sets platform engineering apart from what has happened until now in the market, right? So if you take an internal developer platform, right, like how does that differ from a platform as a service or a PaaS solution, right? Because we've been having these as well for the last like decade plus, right? So like the OG would have been something like Heroku. And nowadays there's a lot of these PaaS popping up all over the place that are targeting like very specific use cases like e-commerce or whatever. And those are great, right? And so often the question sort of in the communities around like, okay, how does an IDP differ from a PaaS, right? And ultimately, an IDP is meant to provide a PaaS-like DevX, right? But on top of the tech and tools that the enterprise is using today. And so that's kind of the key difference, and why a lot of these passes like ultimately haven't scaled up to the enterprise market, is because they are just too opinionated and not flexible enough, right? And so then that so to reconnect to what you're saying, right, it becomes really important that you figure out what is the right path, for the different types of users of the platform, right? Otherwise, they're not going to be happy, and this is where platform engineering, what we advocate for in the community, is basically looking at platform engineering as an unopinionated toolbox to go and build your own opinionated workflows and platform, right? And so that's where you build that basically internal pass, but on top of your own tech and tools, and importantly, having these different golden paths, right? Because ultimately, a pass will basically give you a very kind of hey, this is the adventure; it's already chosen for you, right? Versus a choose your own adventure type of player mode. And and to make this like a little bit more practical, right? Like, let's say you have your senior backend engineer, right? And they really love messing around with their YAML files and so on, and their Helm charts and IAC modules and so forth. And if you now like abstract all of that away from them, like I can guarantee you're going to have an extremely hard time rolling out that platform, right? But on the flip side of that, let's say you have like a really, like a junior front end engineer who doesn't care whether you're running on AKS or EKS, or frankly, they don't care whether you're running on Kubernetes at all, right? And so in that case, it does make sense to provide them with a much more kind of like abstracted, much simpler view of the world, whether that is a UI or fully code based or whatever. And so like side comment on that, we do see that whether even in the cases where you have this like more abstracted thing, the UI, like this like click up stuff, is not usually appreciated by developers, because they're still used to they're kind of like Git based, fully code based kind of workflows. And so that's kind of the preferred interface, and what we see the most successful IDP initiatives kind of figure out is nail really that adoption flow with these different like code based interfaces. And but that's just like an example of you need to provide people with these different golden paths that give them the right amount of context. And there is nobody that can figure that out other than the platform team, right? And if I'm a product team at a PaaS provider, there's no way I can figure out the user preferences of different types of dev teams within company X, right? And so that's where the platform team becomes taking this unopinionated toolbox and do that last mile optimization, right? So what's in the toolbox is going to be like open source solutions like Argo CD and Kubernetes and whatever, and then commercial solutions like Humanitech, for instance, and then go and find what's the right combination of those, and then do that last mile optimization that only you as the platform team can do, and nobody else, right? Not us as Humanitech, not the maintainers of the open source stuff, and not a PaaS provider.
Yeah, it sounds like there's not going to be one size fits all for any organization, but there's certain patterns, essentially this essentially unopinionated toolbox that you can start with, but you're going to end up as a team essentially crafting a somewhat unique product that's going to serve your customer, which is essentially your internal developer team, the best. And that's why like just ripping something off the shelf isn't really going to necessarily work.
Totally. And I mean, like, everybody likes to think they're, special snowflake, and they're not. Like, we see these this configuration issues. Every time we speak to people, they're like, oh yeah, but the way we do, like, we configure workloads, and then it's like literally 98% the same as everybody else. But that 2% does matter, right? And you will have like exotic requirements that just depend on like your specific business model, or your security and compliance requirements and whatever, right? And so this is where it's super important to just provide to create this thought leadership around platform engineering, so that the three different stakeholder groups are on board, right? So like we were saying, the C level is convinced by Gartner, and the platform teams by the community, and the developers by the ease of adoption, like all the different things, right? But then also that they are given this like toolbox that they can then like go and tweak, and they can figure it out on their own.
Yeah. So, I mean, could you give like maybe an example of a challenging or interesting like platform engineering product that or project that you had worked on, and sort of how you approached it, to kind of get into maybe a little bit of the sort of practicalities of actually developing something like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think honestly the most interesting and like common. Well, so I was gonna say, like, what I just explained, that kind of challenge of like what's the right level of abstraction, what's the right interface. I find that to be probably one of the major blockers that platform initiatives find. Another one that just so that we can change is this idea of prioritization, right? And so where I see a lot of platform teams fail is, and this is really like platform team plus C level. They look at this and they're like, all right, we get it. We need to improve developer experience. How do we do that, right? And then they basically approach this problem from a chronological perspective, meaning instead of looking for where is the most pain right now in developer workflows in our current setup, they basically think about, all right, what does a developer do, right? And they start from like, oh, they create a service, then they do this, and they have to deploy, blah blah, and they stop immediately at that first step, and they're like, oh, let's go optimize that, right? Failing to understand that like how often do you do that? Like how often do you create a new service? Like less than 1% of the times, right? And then they basically fall in love with these, like service catalogs that, promise this like reusability and, transparency. And it's great because it's a dashboard, and which manager doesn't love a good dashboard, and all these things, right? And that's the kind of like what I call the prioritization fallacy, right? Which is basically, if you want to build a house, instead of starting with the foundation, you start by building a door, right? And it's like you put a door there, but there's no house behind it, right? And that's kind of like where I see teams fail. And so, how do you address that? Well, you look at where is the most pain, and how do you identify where is the most pain? Well, look at the time spent, right? So we have in Humanitech, for instance, we put together this ROI calculator, which is really an ROI calculator for building IDP more than like specifically building with Humanitech, which is probably something that we should change. But that's where you can see like these how much time is spent by per deployment, per 100 deployments, by developers and operations on different tasks, right? And then that way you can easily understand, all right, this is where really the nuts are in my workflows, and that's what I should go and address first. And guess what, like in the vast majority of cases, the pain points are in how developers handle resources, infrastructure configurations, or application configurations, not in service templating, which can probably just be done by like GitHub templates or whatever ultimately. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like, stuff like Backstage, for instance, like is a great product. And we worked really closely with their product teams, and like there's to integrate it, right? But ultimately it's really just like a portal, a view on top of your internal developer platform. And so again, you want to start with building that foundation, not building the windows of your house.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this sounds like great advice. As we start to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share? Maybe you have some advice for people who are, aspiring to move into platform engineering or interested in building successful platforms. That might be a good place to kind of, wrap things up. What would be your advice essentially for people who are aspiring to work in this area, or maybe even build these teams for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the first thing is come join the community. It's really the best place to get started. Platformengineering.org has a ton of really good resources. We're putting together a whole tooling library there, and platformcon.com. So it's gonna happen on the 8th and 9th of June, and it's free, it's virtual, so people can join from anywhere. And we really have some of the best DevOps platform thought leaders in the world for those 2 days. So I think those are all good starting points. I think if you are already doing some sort of platform engineering and you're kind of like want to level up, it'd be great to, like, one sort of like call to action that I want to share with everybody is to go and like also just share what it is that you've been doing until now, right? And specifically, what is the architecture of the platform that you're building? Because that's how we all provide each other with different blueprints, right? Because I feel like the community has gone through this last year and a half of, hey, listen to me. If you want true DevOps, if you want true, you build it, you run it at the enterprise scale, you need to build some sort of platform layer to enable that. And it feels like now there are finally a lot of people listening, as we said. Gartner is writing about it. Everyone is writing about it. And so people are coming in hot, right? They're like, okay, this is cool. It's trending. I'm in. Where do I go next? And then there's crickets. There's not enough, sort of like clear design principles, design patterns, reference architectures, and really just good starting points for people to get going on their platform journey. And so that is a major focus for us this year in the community. Is, the track that I'm looking forward to the most at PlatformCon is platform blueprints. And so I would encourage everybody to just like go and like come and share more around like what is the platform that you build, what are the challenges, and really just sharing like so that people can have a starting point. And we're gonna have soon in the next couple of months like actual fully coded out reference architectures that people can start getting started with. And so come join us. I think it's this year is going to be super interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. And Luca, thanks so much for being here. It's, as you mentioned, like this concept has been around for, 10, 15 years. So it's not necessarily new, but it sounds like there's a lot of, momentum essentially in this space. But as you mentioned, it's also like, just hit the hype cycle with Gartner. So in many ways, it's just kind of like the beginning of this journey of platform engineering. And to be honest, I feel like in this conversation, I've found like whatever my next job is going to be is moving into like platform engineering, product management, because I've worked as a product manager and developer experience. I built a lot of dev tools, and I worked as an engineer and worked in developer relations. It's like the culmination of all these things that I've done. It sounds like it's like a perfect match. So maybe I'll look at that next.
I love that. Yeah. Let me know if you're interested in exploring more. Happy to help with that. And thanks for having me, Sean. This was fun.
Awesome. Cheers.